Okay, to the reason you have all tuned in, today we welcome Dr. Peter Adams. Peter has 2 decades of research experience in vertebrate pest ecology with a focus on feral pigs, wild dogs, foxes, feral cats, and rabbits in WA. In recent years, Peter has worked on facilitating coordinated and improved vertebrate pest management by community-led groups through WA. This involves the adoption of best practice management and innovative technologies to improve control efficiency. So Peter is very well qualified to talk on the subject today of vertebrate pest management on your farm. So a very big welcome to you, Peter, and over to you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for that introduction, Kate. Great to be with everybody today. I would very much like to re-emphasize Kate's comments in regards to questions. I love questions. It helps me feel that I'm hopefully answering questions or providing information that people want to know. So at any point in time throughout my presentation, please, if you've got a question, pop it in the chat, and Kate can ask that question. We can deal with it as we go. I know that me personally, I always manage to forget half the questions that I have by the time I get to the end of the presentation. So let her rip whilst we're talking. One other thing that I will say is there are one or two, not many. There might be 1 or 2 photos or images in this presentation that might be a little bit confronting, just so you got a bit of a heads up there. But I was going to say, to be blunt, I don't apologise for that. This is vertebrate pest management. This is what it is. So we're not trying to gloss over or put too much cotton wool around this process. Sorry. So let's kick off. So vertebrate pest management on your farm. Let's get started. Always in recent times like to start presentations or when I'm talking to people at a workshop to try and understand or get an idea of what people think effective pest management looks like. And in many instances, not always, but in many instances, pest management tends to look something like this. Lots of dead animals, regardless of what which kind of pest they are, but certainly dead animals in bulk. That is certainly the image that pest management tends to have assigned to it. But from my point of view, when we talk about pest management, I'm saying effective pest management. What I think effective pest management looks like is a lot more like this. It's community members and landholders, stakeholders coming together to work together to deal with a particular chosen pest or suite of pests. This is ultimately going to give you a lot better bang for your buck when it comes to managing pests at a landscape level. And what we have, this might seem a little bit dry. I'm going to try and make it as least dry as I possibly can. There's basically 7 principles or 7 core principles to pest animal management. And if you take note, you can see down the bottom here, I've got a website. It's Pest Mar website. This is a national website. It's almost a one-stop website for pretty much any resource or material that you might have regarding declared pests. And it's a very national focus, but the material there is incredibly useful and helpful for landholders, whether you're a farmer, whether you're a land manager through natural resources. It's a very good resource to acquaint yourself with and be familiar with the material that's on that website. But there's seven basic principles that we have approaching a pest animal management process, and I'll run through these and we'll sort of work in examples of this, of why they are important or they're worthwhile knowing about or considering. First and foremost, quite importantly, is that pests are a human-defined idea. And what do we mean by that? It's basically a pest is a pest purely because we as a species or humans find issue with them, whether it's agricultural impact, whether it's damage or impact upon biodiversity, whether it's just impacts upon our social or cultural values as well. These are all impacts that we can use to consider or define an animal as a pest. The reason it's important is we also need to be aware that one person's pest could quite easily be another person's value or resource. So whilst pigs are widely regarded across the nation, especially now in recent times with the threat of African swine fever, feral pigs are fast becoming not necessarily public enemy number one, but they're right up there on that list. There are still segments of society that value these animals as a hunting resource or a pastime, or they assign value to those animals other than just being a straight up pest. And that's important because it has an influence on how management can proceed with these animals. And what I like to say is it's not a pest problem, it's a people problem, because people are very complicated and we can make things very tricky because we need to deal with each other to ensure that something happens. So if you're trying to do a pig control program, you need to ensure that you have key stakeholder support for that program. Otherwise, you're working against yourself or against each other.
Peter, can I just interrupt for a second? Someone said they can't hear you very well. Maybe just move your microphone a bit closer.
Sure, and I'll try talking a little bit louder too. I was trying to talk in soft, dulcet tones, so I didn't come across too harshly, but hopefully that's a bit better. So I'll bring my volume up a little bit more, and hopefully that's better. Okay, so what we've covered there is that pests are human defined. It's a human label that we've assigned to these animals, and how we value them has a massive influence on how we manage them as well. Moving on, principle 2, having identified the pest label or what is a pest or assigning it as a pest issue, you need to engage your key stakeholders. And I will find myself saying that time and time again, and you will note that because the reason I do it, it's important. Operating by yourself can have immediate impacts on a very localized scale, but most issues is with a pest, you're generally talking about an animal that is, particularly vertebrate pests, animals which can move freely within the landscape. They don't respect or pay attention to boundary fences. They don't really care about tenure, and they go where they want to. They go where the food is, they go where the water is, they go where the resources are that they're trying to exploit. So dealing with a pest on your property is commendable and is good effort, but in the long run, you will have a better impact on that pest population by working on the pests that are on your property in coordination with your neighbour and your neighbour's neighbour as well. So an example of that is pests are, they're subject to the tragedy of the commons issue. So if we look at this diagram, for instance, we say we've got a multitude of different landholders or land holdings across the landscape, and we have a pest population or a distribution of a pest across that region, indicated by the green colouring. If everybody pitches in and does their control and removes the animals from their properties, except for one landholder, well, we all know what's going to happen is it's only a matter of time before you've returned to the situation that you were in, and it becomes a circular process that just starts burning money and leads to fatigue. So you really need to get or work as hard as possible to ensure that you've got all of your stakeholders or your key stakeholders on board as effectively as you can. Now, that's not something that's easy. It's easy to say. It's not something that's easily achieved because it all boils down to personal relationships. So it comes back to a people problem. You need to build and maintain relationships with stakeholders to ensure that you have effective communication and you also have meaningful buy-in and participation. That is the key. So to sum that up, effective pest management is strategic. You need to be coordinated. You want to try and have a community-wide approach. You want to use multiple techniques that are at your disposal. And you want to think about targeting the pest not necessarily just on your property, but ideally at the population scale. And sometimes that scale might be just too large, but you want to be thinking as large scale as you possibly can. And that last point there is very easy to write, but a completely different kettle of fish to put into practice. That's undertaking tenure blind operations. And that's the key about having strategic coordination, stakeholder involvement, and working with your neighbour and your neighbour's neighbour so that you are able to tackle these pests or target your control in areas where it is most likely to have the best impact. And that may not necessarily be on your property. It might be on somebody else's property. That's where you need that relationship. And the image that I've got here on this slide might seem a little bit random, just a bunch of people standing in front of a helicopter, but I use that as a bit of a capture to represent trying to have that involved and coordinated approach. That photo basically represents two government agencies as well as a recognised body or community body that represents the private landholders within a district, and they're all working together to control a pest. In that instance, that's actually up in the northern agricultural region, and the pest of choice on that day was feral pigs. So we need to know, we need to be aware that pests are issues that we've created from our own system of belief, whether it's because they're impacting our productivity, whether they're impacting biodiversity. We need to work together, but we also need to understand or accept that in some instances, especially when it comes to widespread and established pests, that eradication is a commendable aim or goal, but in reality is unlikely in many instances, unless, of course, you have a pest that's only just become established or is only just spreading into your district. Those sorts of areas, containment or eradication may become a possibility or an option. But if you've got pests, in particular, the three pests that we're going to really talk about today, rabbits, foxes, and feral pigs, have in the southwest have very well established ranges and are very widespread. So eradication at the broad scale is not necessarily something that is going to be achievable. And we say that because it's worth being aware of that concept to avoid the potential for burnout, is that you can set yourself unreasonable goals and those can actually impact on stakeholder participation and can potentially lead to participants dropping out or a sense of being overwhelmed, like how on earth are we ever going to eradicate this pest? You need to pick the battles that you can win. So you need to be able to work on goals or set yourself goals that are achievable. And that comes with trial and error. You're not expected to know what's going to be achievable from the get-go. No one's going to hold you to a promise that you might have made at the start, but certainly it's worthwhile learning as you go. So, as I've sort of indicated, the best time to manage your pests is before they're a pest. Insurance policies would be great. If we could treat pests as insurance policy and say, well, that's right. Well, before it becomes an issue, or this is money that we want to spend, or this is a problem we want to tackle or invest time and energy into, but hopefully never have to have a major issue with, is the best way. But the counterbalance to that is typically when you've got your pest at low densities, they've only just entered the district or they're very low numbers, their impacts are very negligible and they're very difficult to detect. So there's a variety of other issues that get prioritised, and whether that's your day-to-day farming practices, responding to a range of different climatic conditions. Again, I'll hark back to the northern agricultural sector. We're coming through an ideal time of the year for feral pig control, but about a month ago, through my core study area, a lot of landholders were seriously impacted by Cyclone Seroja. So certainly in response to that, and now they're seeding, feral pig management has really slipped down that ladder of priorities, and that is to be expected. So what we have is what's commonly referred to as the invasion curve. When we talk about species that are widespread and abundant, you've already got that mass, that crucial mass of that population in your landscape. At those sorts of numbers, those sorts of distributions, we're over here in the right-hand side of the curve, where really the reality of managing that pest is geared towards protecting assets, whether that be farm infrastructure, most often crops or the food that you're growing, or biodiversity values in remnant vegetation. We're talking about protecting the asset. We go over to the left-hand side of the curve, we can talk about more serious control, things like prevention of entry of species. So things that haven't come into the state, haven't come into the country. These are species that we know we can plan ahead, and we can know that they are potential risks. We can put in pre-border controls to try and prevent them from coming in, but if they do happen to come in, we can have quick responses to then jump on board and make sure we eradicate those before they become established. And as you can see on the bottom of the graph here, depending on where you are on that invasion curve, there's a return, an indicative return on investment. Over here for asset-based protection, you can talk about for every dollar that you spend on protecting your assets, you can expect between 1 to 5-fold return. To the left-hand side of the invasion curve, if we can avoid the issue of a pest becoming or entering the country or the state or your district, you have a much higher, up to 100-fold return on your investment. But having said that, a 1 to 5-fold return on your investment is still a significant investment. And what we end up working with is, when we look at the invasion curve and we try and populate that with different species of pests, we can certainly see that things like pigs, foxes, rabbits, camels, goats, widespread and established species, pest species, fit here on the right-hand side of the curve, where under current conditions, current controls, we're unable or unlikely to achieve eradication of these species. Whereas on the left-hand side, things like the black-spined Asian toad, starlings, palm squirrels starting to move out, and deer, these are areas where we can do better control because they have not yet reached those thresholds. Deer is certainly an issue in the southwest that is growing, and we're probably going to see them to start slip up that invasion curve a little bit as well. But we're still pressed that, whilst they're in low densities, that's when you're going to get your best return on investment. But the catch is trying to encourage or engender sufficient drive or interest to manage pests at a community level when they're at these low levels is difficult. And the agency here at pre-border control, government agencies are best placed because those are the organisations that are in control of our borders. So those are the ones that are able to best deliver here, and the economic return can justify investment on management here. Whereas when you've got widespread and abundant pests, this is where it falls much more to community control, because the government just does not have the resources or the staffing available to be dealing with these pests on a landscape level. So, principle 4 of pest management is ideally your program should focus on outcomes. When an eradication or containment of a pest is not achievable, as the previous graph has shown, we move towards asset protection or reducing the impact that those animals or those pests have below a certain threshold. But of course, to reduce their impacts below a threshold, we need to have a bit of information about that pest and what their impacts are. And that's not always readily available. Some pest species, rabbits in particular, there is a long history of research working on their impacts and their response to control, and we have values and thresholds that we can set or we can identify in regards to where you want to have that population to get the best benefit. Many other species, we don't have that information available. But ultimately, what that threshold is depends on the asset in question, as well as the pest that you're dealing with. For example, we talk about wild dogs. We have a very low threshold for wild dogs. Many producers will attest to the fact that one dog in the stock paddock is one dog too many. So in many instances, the threshold that they want to achieve is 0. And that's tricky because that's effectively looking at localized eradication, localized obviously around stock paddocks. The way that we achieve that is by using a multitude of tools, but also using some pretty expensive and significant exclusion fencing in large tracts of land. And the state probably owns one of the most expensive fences, known as the state barrier fence, that runs from north of Kalbarri, and when it's completed will run all the way down to east of Esperance, and particularly, specifically driven out of the fact of preventing pests from moving out of the rangelands and into our agricultural sectors. And wild dogs in particular has been the focus of that fence in recent years. Another pest species in particular, the rabbit. We know that we've done a lot of work on these animals. We know that in some instances, if we're doing revegetation work, as even less than 1 rabbit per hectare is a high enough density to actually cause the complete failure of that revegetation work. So it depends on what you're trying to achieve. It depends on the pest that you're dealing with, on how or what sort of threshold you need to aim for. In many instances, what you need to do, the general rule of thumb is when you have pest abundance, you need to be focusing on trying to remove around 70 to 75% of the population each year to have a net downward trend in the abundance of those species, to drive them from current abundance down to whatever your threshold level may or may not be. Again, another thing that's easy to say, not necessarily easy to do. But that is the scale. So that's why we're saying if you're looking at an eradication program or trying to minimize impact significantly, you need to realize that they're talking a high scale or a high level of input into that program to achieve the outcomes that you're aiming for. Principle 5 is that pest management needs to consider or think of a whole system approach. Pest species are just one issue in a landscape that we're working in. And most instances, just about all cases, the way they interact with the farming system, the way they interact with whatever management system we're looking at, it's going to be complex. A very simplistic example here is a hypothetical process or project where you may have something like a red fox predating upon wildlife. And what you want to do is you want to manage the red foxes to reduce the impact on the wildlife and allow the wildlife to increase in abundance. A great idea. So what you do is you knock out your foxes, or you reduce your fox abundance through a coordinated program, which reduces the impact or the influence of that species on your wildlife. Fantastic. But what we have seen in multiple occasions is in doing that, generally, it also reduces the impact of foxes on another pest species, for instance, rabbits, which will potentially increase in number, which will have an increased influence or impact upon the vegetation, which your native wildlife require to hide from predators, from introduced predators like foxes and feral cats. And as a result, you could see an increase in feral cat numbers, which, because you've got abundant food through rabbits, you've got less refuge for your native wildlife to hide in, which makes them more susceptible to cat predation than they were before you started doing your fox control. So again, it's almost the golden rule is almost that it will never be straightforward.
Peter, we've got a question about a couple of slides back about the exclusion fencing. Does that actually work for pigs?
Yes, it can work. We are in the process of working that out and learning that issue. What we're finding is there's a variety of different exclusion fencing styles that can be used, and many people look at exclusion fencing for pigs by, fantastic, I'm going to run a hot wire that'll stop them. Electrifying fences does work quite well at stopping pigs, but running a hot wire around your old 15, 20, 30-year-old sheep fence is not going to be a guaranteed fix for pigs. It might deter them for a little while, but if there's food on the other side, they will pressure that fence. What we're seeing is it comes back to a whole of system approach, is almost regardless of whether you're trying to exclude pigs, dogs, rabbits, whatever, we're starting to realize or look at what you've got to do is you've got to build a kangaroo exclusion fence, because kangaroos will dig at a fence and they'll create a small hole, which the pigs will very rapidly monopolize, and that small hole becomes a big hole, and then everything can move through it. So exclusion fencing certainly has a role, and it can work effectively, very effectively, but it is also an expensive option or an expensive tool or technique to be using, and requires ongoing maintenance. But certainly I am aware of producers in the Manjimup region, particularly growing truffles, a high value produce or crop. They have got pig exclusion fence around that property, and that does effectively exclude pigs from that property. But you're talking about a tightly strung mesh fence, potentially with a hot wire, but also with a lap wire. And that lap wire is expensive, but ultimately the lap wire, what we're starting to see, and again, we don't have hard data on this, but we're certainly starting to see that lap wire is really the big difference between short-term exclusion and medium-term exclusion by fences. Now, I say medium rather than long-term because fences suffer from trees falling on them, rain events and washouts, those sorts of things, and the maintenance required to keep them intact. But certainly, fences do have a role, and we are seeing in the northern ag region, with pigs in particular, that fences are being used not necessarily to exclude completely pigs from cropping paddocks, but also potentially to guide them. So guide them away from potentially high value cropping land to slightly lower cropping land, where they can then target control of those pigs. I know I personally, when I if I come up against a fence and I've only got to go a couple of 100 meters down the fence line to find an easy way to go around the end, I'll do that rather than try and pressure against a fence. And animals are not necessarily that different, but when they have no other option and they're fully excluded, they will push and they will pressure that fence until something gives. hopefully that was hopefully that was a good synopsis or a bit of information that was required. And we do talk about fences a little bit later too. So principle 6, we need to realise our own limitations. Is we are operating in a ecosystem or a landscape where we don't have all the answers. The behaviour of our pest animal, the behaviour of our stock, the behaviour of our wildlife, the behaviour of people that we share the landscape with all varies, and it can vary both in time and in space. So it can vary from area to area and can vary within an area over time. People change their minds. We also have a range of control techniques that are available, but it's not an exhaustive list. In many instances, we actually have relatively limited techniques available to us, and we need to husband them carefully. So we need to accept that we don't know everything, and what works in one area may not necessarily work as well or at all in another. And that's what we call taking an adaptive management approach. So certainly it's great to set out a plan of action, but if that action doesn't work, you need to be able to go back and modify. And how you do that is obviously by having an effective monitoring and or evaluation process. So by monitoring how you're working, how your pest management program is running, you'll know if you are achieving what you're trying to achieve, or if you're trending in the right direction, or if something has happened that's completely out of left field and you might end up going in the other direction. That's how you know what's happening. The use of kill numbers and kill numbers alone is information, but it's not information that has a suitable level of context to really guide you effectively. Because, if you say, well, we've caught 10 pigs in this trap and we've not caught, it's a month later, we haven't caught any more pigs in that trap, therefore we got rid of all the pigs. That's one assumption. It might be that you've caught all of the pigs that were susceptible to being caught in that trap, and you might have the rest of the population walk past your trap every night and eat their fill out of your paddock. So effective monitoring gives you the ability to track how your program is working. And ideally that needs to be independent of your control techniques, because your control influences the behavior of your pest. What I've got here is sort of a range of different methods of monitoring, but one of the simplest ones that we have available to us is feral scan. And possibly you may have heard of feral scan previously. It's a national program that's geared towards either from the individual landholder to a district group to a state level group and up. It's designed to be adaptable to all of those levels, and used as a recording and monitoring tool. So you can record your pest animal dispatch data in this tool, as well as recording your damage sightings or your other sightings of your pests. So, and that's your monitoring, and that's important to know. If you're doing pest control, do the number of sightings of that pest across the landscape decrease over time? It's a very effective way. That's one way that is a good indicator or potential indicator of whether or not your control is having an effect. A good example of that, I'm a little bit biased to say that's a good example. This is some work I've done, so naturally I'm going to say this is a good example, but let me be less biased and say here is an example of the power of monitoring. And I return us back to the northern agricultural sector. And back in 2018, they started a concerted control program for feral pigs. And that involved engagement of stakeholders, landholders on ground, to undertake trapping and baiting, but also the implementation of an annual aerial cull program. And so what I did was when they said they were going to do that, I said, great, let me grab some cameras and we're going to monitor pig activity across the district to see how it tracks over time from year to year. And this is the data from the first 2 years of that control program. Now, the shoot, so basically this is where we started up here with the density, a very high density of pigs. What we had was when the first shoot came in, we had a little bit of a decrease in activity, and then our activity increased again. What happened before the shoot and after the shoot was, well, before the aerial shoot, pigs walked past our cameras. After the chopper had been through, the pigs ran past our cameras because they were very stirred up and got very toey and very flighty, which could have influenced their activity levels. But what we also did was the trapping and baiting programs carried out by the landholders was very successful, and I would argue that the aerial shoot helped to incentivize the landholders to undertake that work, because you had this very visual sort of control activity. Everybody knew about it. It was a helicopter that came in and they flew around and they shot pigs. I mean, it captured everyone's imagination. It certainly captured all of the males' imaginations, at least anyway, in the district. And it got people talking and it got people thinking. And what we saw at the end of that 12 months was, based on feral pig activity, we'd reduced that population by about 82%, which is a phenomenal drop, especially because you need to realise this is a study area with open boundaries. There were no physical boundaries around this. This is a patch of ground in an ocean of feral pigs, and we reduced the population in that area by 82%. And what helped confirm that is we saw at the start of the program, we would see big, small, medium, all sorts of different sizes of pigs on camera. But by the end of that year, we were only seeing adult pigs with very, very small young at foot. So we could infer that we'd taken out an entire generation of the pest in that landscape. What was even more important was it didn't stop after the first year. They revisited the program again in the second year. The chopper came in, another aerial shoot over the same sorts of areas. The landholders again incentivized to maintain their trapping and baiting program, and the data shows that we dropped the population by another 76%. And what we'd seen here at the end of year 2 was not only that shift in the size ranges of the pigs, but basically we changed the sex ratio of the population. We had gone from basically a 1-to-1 male-female ratio to a 3-to-1. Basically, we were getting 3 boars to every sow that was being taken out of that environment. So what we'd done was we could see again that we were really decreasing that population. So again, that was fantastic evidence, because typically those animals that are going to move into an area, when you take animals out of a landscape, you create a vacuum, and naturally animals, those pests will then want to move from areas of high density into an area of low density because there's more resources. Those animals that are more likely to move, particularly when it comes to pigs, into that new territory or into that vacuum would be males. But that monitoring on those cameras is essential to know how we're doing, because we still are removing effectively the same number of pigs out of that landscape on a year-by-year basis. But that monitoring shows we are actually having an impact in reducing the population. So we've gone through those principles, and hopefully everyone's still awake, and I haven't bored anyone to sleep, but I'm guessing I'm reading everybody's minds like, yes, that's fantastic. Principles, good. How do we control them? What do we do if we've got these pests? How do we control them? Well, strategic pest management. Think about the pest. Okay, it's not the same approach. One size does not fit all. Think about what tools are available. As I mentioned earlier, we don't have an exhaustive list of tools. In fact, in reality, our tool availability, or the tools we have at our disposal, are really shrinking as we move forward, because we're always striving to be more humane with animal welfare. and more effective. Think about your landscape. Think about where you're operating. Is it cropping land? Do you have livestock? What does your neighbour have on their property? And very, very importantly is the application of an integrated control approach. And this is incredibly important. It's important because there is no such thing as a silver bullet. There may be, but we don't have the process whereby the silver bullet solves all of our problems. Because ultimately, when we talk about pest management, we're generally talking about lethal control. Lethal control is an exceptionally strong selection pressure, because if you don't pass the test, i.e. you fail, you succumb to the lethal control as a pest, you don't get to pass your genes on to the next generation. So those pests that are breeding the next generation typically are animals that have avoided or managed to miss out on that lethal control. So we've got to be aware that we are potentially training our population, and that training is known as control aversion. The idea behind that is if you have a normal, natural population, again, you'll see my piggy focus, and I've got little pigs here as my examples. You've got a population of individuals that are all different, like you and I. We're all one species, but we all have different personalities. The same thing goes with pests. Some of those animals are going to be more inclined to explore new, novel things that they find in the environment, whereas others are going to be a lot more wary and will shy away or avoid at all costs those sorts of things. So naturally, when you apply your control technique to a population, you will invariably take out those animals that are less wary. You're going to take out those animals that are a bit silly, particularly the younger animals. They don't have that life experience. And the sum result over time, if you keep applying that same control technique, is you're only going to let those animals that avoid your control technique survive, so they will breed a population of pests that also have that inherent level of avoidance to your control technique. And if they become immune or resistant to your control technique, you're going to end up spinning your wheels, wearing yourself out, spending money, but not having an impact on your population. So that's why you need to mix things up. If you apply one control, you need to apply another control. So those animals that have avoided your first control technique, hopefully you can mop them up with a different control process. So let's look at this. Let's think about this. For instance, here's an example. Let's talk about foxes. We talk about their biology a little bit. They breed once a year. We can see the little time frame down the bottom of the slide there. They typically breed through the middle of the year, so they're pairing up now, getting ready to breed. Come August, September, they'll be having their cubs. Over October, November, those cubs will be getting weaned. They'll be growing up. Mum and dad will be getting sick and tired of them, kick them out of home. Come December, over the summer period, those cubs will then be striking out on their own, and they'll be moving around the environment. Now, I don't think this should be any major surprise to too many people, but certainly you see that, particularly in summer. There's a lot of dumb foxes around. They get hit by cars on the road. They do some weird stuff. You just see them in the middle of the day. These are young dispersers that haven't really learnt the ways of the big wide world, so to speak. One thing that we do, and again, another talk about concerted control programs, is the red card for the red fox. And this is some work. These are the results of some work that myself and two or three honours students did a few years ago throughout the southwest. Was we went along to the red card for the red fox programs, and we collected almost 500 dead foxes and took samples from them. We worked out how old they were. We looked at their diet. We looked at their parasite loads. We looked at their skull morphology, all that sort of stuff. But the big thing was we looked at their age. And red card for the red fox program occurs in February and March. And that's typically a time of the year when it's kind of the downtime for farming, if we can ever say there's a downtime for farming. It's a less busy time of year. People are more able or available to go out and do spotlight shooting over the weekends. Typically, we're leading up to lambing, so you want to make sure you reduce your fox densities. But it also directly coincides with that time of year where the landscape is, for want of other words, saturated with dispersing young foxes, wandering around, being silly, falling easy prey to spotlight shooting. And that's exactly what our data showed, was when we aged the foxes that were shot and brought in, 83, if my sums are correct, 82% of all of those foxes were less than 2 years of age. So these were young dispersers that potentially were going to meet a bit of a grisly end through misadventure or their own silly dumb fault. What you see is a much, much smaller proportion of those animals collected from the shoot were of an older age, 3 years or more. And those are your breeding individuals. Those are your animals that will pair up in the middle of the year and produce the next batch of young animals, the next generation. So this Red Calf the Red Fox program is a fantastic program for getting people together and getting and instigating community control, or a community control program that's generally district wide, but it's not necessarily targeting the breeding cohort of your population. It's not saying it's a waste of time. I'm not saying that at all. It is certainly removing a large chunk of the population, but that population that they are removing were probably subject to being removed anyway. The true value with the Red Calf, the Red Fox program is it brings so many people together. It's an ideal option to say, right, now that we've done this culling program, what are we going to do about fox control for the rest of the year? Because if I just go back one slide, whilst they're dispersing, there's a lot of young dumb animals. They're very easy to shoot. But it doesn't mean that the rest of the year they're immune to control. Because when they're breeding, the male fox doesn't have much else on his mind except finding a female. They get a bit hard to get a handle on those animals at that time of year. But when they're having their cubs and feeding them, there's a great food demand. So the male's out collecting food and bringing it back to the vixen in the den. And then when the cubs are getting older, she's going out scrounging for food as well because she needs to find food to feed. You know, it's a big demand. That's a time of year when foxes are very readily going to take baits. Now, foxes traditionally take baits because they're scavenging as well. They're a very strong scavenger. But again, ideal opportunities to target the area. They're not moving great distances. They're all huddled up in areas. If you know your landscape, you know your farm, you'll generally have a pretty good idea of where the foxes will be breeding, or where they might be denned up. Good areas to go and target those. And again, specific targeted bait deployment can have a very big or very strong impact on those animals and those individuals in the landscape. The reason I say that is if you rely on one control method, for instance, shooting, you're going to train your animals to avoid that. And I'm pretty sure if I took a poll of the people listening, I'm pretty sure that most people would say it's not as easy to shoot a fox spotlighting today than it was 20 years ago. Because there's foxes out there that I know I've got relatives as well that say, I can remember this from even up to 10 years ago, move into a paddock, shine the light, they see the eyes and they never see that animal again. It's taken one look at that spotlight and knows what it is, and they've gone to ground and they've disappeared. So if you think about foxes, and again, this is trying to visualize what we've got within the landscape. This is a study out of Victoria, but it was done in sheep and cattle grazing country that worked out through mark and recapture that there was a density of around about 4 foxes per square kilometre. Now, I've spoken to a number of workshops and groups in the southwest, and most people agree that that's probably not an unreasonable number or density for foxes in the southwest. So if you use those numbers and do a little bit of arithmetic, if you're at home standing on your front porch and you can look down to your front drive, and let's say your front drive's 2 kilometres away, if you were to swing that in an arc around your house, that 2 kilometre arc, you're looking at 12 and a half square kilometres, which means that within that area, there's something in the order of about 50 foxes. If you go out to 5 kilometres, that number blows out to 300 odd foxes. And if you go 10 kilometres, it blows out to over 1,200 foxes. Now, that is a huge number of animals. You got to ask yourself, are you seeing all of those animals? Do you see all of those animals in that area? Even if you halve that density, it's still significant numbers of animals. In that sort of area, how many foxes do you think you would see if you were spotlighting or just on your daily chores around the farm, that sort of stuff? Because the animals you see are the only ones that are going to be exposed to a shooting program, whether it be spotlighting or whether it be whistling or shooting during the day. So whilst, a lot of people enjoy going out and shooting foxes, it can be a little bit tricky to try and have a significant impact or reduce 75% of those foxes. So if you've got 50 foxes in your 2 kilometre range, you're going to have to do something like take out the order of something like 36 foxes to actually start to decrease the density of foxes in that area. So these are just thoughts. So think about what other techniques can we use. And again, baiting is widely the cheaper option when it comes to labour and cost for pest management. So you've got shooting for foxes, there's trapping, I've mentioned baiting, and also repellent devices as well. So there's a range of different devices or tools that are available for foxes, and ideally they all need to be used in conjunction with one another to have the best impact or best outcome. And in terms of repellent devices, certainly I know that there's some good results with chicken farmers in the southwest using livestock guardian animals. There's numerous people talking great things about things like fox lights as a repellent device. And what I was saying earlier about that control aversion, like animals learning to avoid your control technique, the reason that fox lights work is quintessential evidence that control aversion occurs, because what this fox light does is it waits till it gets dark, and then what it does is it turns on a light beam that flashes and sweeps around the countryside all night long, simulating the light of a spotlight sweeping across the landscape. And foxes avoid it because they've learnt that if you see a bright light shining on the landscape, it's best to go the other way or you might end up getting shot. So we've actually developed some repellent devices based purely around this pest species' ability to become resistant or aversive to our control technique, one of our popular control techniques. So when you think about pest management, things that you need to think about that are very important is the size of your management program. Are you doing it on your property? Ideally, talk to your neighbour, include them into your program. If you can work with them, that'll give you a much better coverage, because again, particularly if we're talking about foxes, they are very fluid within the landscape and they move very readily. And in some instances, they can cover very large distances in one night. Think about the time of the year. What is your pest doing? Whatever they're doing, as it changes throughout the year, changes their susceptibility to different control tools. So it's good to be aware of that and think, what's the best option? What tool is going to be most useful at this time of year for this pest that I want to target? You need to obviously think about things such as stock as well. If you're doing, even if you're shooting, if you're using baits, you think about the weather and how much time you have available to do this. All of this work is labour intensive. There's no getting around it. It takes time and effort, and persisting and committing that time long term is essential to getting a good result. But it's also going to be a hard ask, because When you've got a seed, you've got a seed. When you have to harvest, you have to harvest. The pest animals don't take time off whilst you're doing those other chores. Let's think about those same sorts of processes and talk about rabbits. We have an incredibly long history of controlling them, but they're still here. They are still our number one vertebrate pest species in Australia, probably because we know the most about their impacts and we know the cost that they can cause to the agricultural sector. The other issue is, we always like to say, rabbits breed like rabbits, and it's phenomenal, the reproductive potential of these pests. And, when you do the sums and you look at what they can do, as it says down the bottom, it can only be as short as 2 years from 200 individuals in the district, blowing out to something in the order of 40,000. It's phenomenal. And that's the reason why we end up with, or we used to have, scenes right across Australia like this. Rabbit plague numbers, good bit of exclusion fencing there in the background to try and stop them, to varying effects, and these sorts of things. But again, these sorts of photos where we had rabbiters going out, and that would be one night's work for one rabbiter, but it still didn't make a difference to the population at all. Not until 1950s we brought along and released myxomatosis. That was a phenomenal success in regards to reducing the abundance of rabbits. There's something in the order of 10 billion animals, they estimated, 10 billion rabbits in Australia, and that dropped significantly down by 99.8%. But the issue is 0.2% of 10 billion is still somewhere in the order of 20 million or 200 million, I forget now. But we saw this massive drop due to myxomatosis, and with the work that's been done and the research that's been done, we know that we've dropped it below the rabbit impact threshold. Problem was, it was so effective, everyone went, great, problem solved, no more rabbits, and we got on and we did different things. We didn't have rabbiters, we didn't do our bait laying, den fumigation, all those sorts of things, and of course the rabbit numbers came back to the 90s, where we had to get the calicivirus and release the calicivirus. And again, that's knocked it back down below the threshold, the impact threshold, but only just. And numbers are on the increase, and only a few years ago we released the K5 variant, and now looking at using additional strains of calicivirus to try and control rabbits into the future. But the tendency for us to rely on that silver bullet, that biological control, is also our Achilles heel. The full benefit of biological control is only realised if we also do the hard work with it as well. Follow-up baiting, getting rid of the harbour, getting rid of warrens, fumigating, shooting, fencing them out, stopping them. Those sorts of, that additional effort, that additional work is crucial to making long-term impacts on rabbit numbers. And rabbits are not like foxes. They don't necessarily get up sticks and walk or hop large distances, so they spread quite slowly. So it is possible to achieve localized eradication, localized reduction, significant reductions in rabbit numbers within a district or within a landscape as well. 3-4 years ago, when they were releasing the K5, we actually had the RHDV2 virus come through and basically gazumped the K5 release. It basically wiped through. It was very virulent, and it went through and wiped out most of the rabbits. So when we came to do the coordinated community release of the K5, there were no rabbits left. And I remember that 3 or 5 years ago talking to people and like, yeah, rabbits. No, we had some, but no, they're all gone now. They all, the virus came through, wiped them out. So, okay. No rabbits. There's only 1 or 2. And, today rabbits are again on the rise, and we're getting increasing reports, especially from the southwest, about what are we doing about these rabbits? These rabbits are out of control. They're high in number. Where are they coming from? What can we do about it? Feral pigs. topic that is close to my heart. I do a lot of work on feral pigs as well. For a very large animal, much larger than a rabbit, their reproductive potential is nothing to sneeze at either. They can double their population in as little as 18 months if nothing's done. So they have for a big ugly animal, they are able to reproduce and build their numbers very quickly. So they can explode, maybe not quite to the level that rabbits do, but still over a relatively short period of time, they can really explode in number. And if you're looking at the slide, you can see that whilst I've mentioned that they're very generally sedentary but highly mobile. So again, they can move large distances in a short period of time if they need to, but generally they like to hang around in an area where they've got what they need, and that's generally food, water, and shelter. And that's a behavioural trait that you need to use to your advantage to capitalise on managing them. Their social structure, again, basically, the mob sizes are typically built around a nucleus of a couple of sows, depending on how big the mob is. And they will be generally related sows, sisters or siblings. Sorry, that's the same thing. Sisters, or they'll be mother and daughters, or previous generations. And they'll be associated with their offspring, and there might be a boar or a couple of boars associated with that mob too. But generally, when the boars get big enough and old enough, they generally get kicked off and form a little satellite mob that hangs around with that maternal group, waiting and working out whether they're going to become big adult boars and strike out on their own, or if they can meet up with another mob or form their own little splinter group. And then you get the big adult solitary boars, which like to spend generally a lot of time by themselves and don't really interact with other pigs or other mobs or groups unless when they're there to breed or pass on the benefit of their genes. And the trick here is, when you look at a lot of hunting that goes on with pigs, the primary focus is around that adult solitary boar. So he's hard to find. He's generally by himself. So taking out one or two boars isn't going to make a big difference on your population, especially given that it only takes one male, and he can be the smallest, runtiest boar in the entire landscape. If there's no one else around, he will service every single sow in that landscape. So to have an impact on your pig population, you need to remove every single male. Or you can target the sows, because they're the breeding engine for the population. Those are the ones where you're going to get the biggest bang for your buck by removing the sows out of the population. And I apologise for being sexist to the audience, but that's just the way it is. The sows, the females, really run the show, and if you target them, you're going to get a better bang for your buck. And it's another good benefit is the boars move a lot. The sows tend not to move. They pick an area where they can breed and have their piglets, and they don't move unless they're pushed, and that makes it easier for you to do control. This is an example of the difference between sows and boars, and this is about 5 months worth of tracking data on a couple of sows down south in the Walpole Wilderness area. It's pure bush. There's a river system flowing through the middle of those two populations, but basically they had relatively small home ranges, 68 and 190 hectares. And the reason Molly's home range was larger was her collar lasted for an extra 3 months over Daisy's, whereas if Daisy's collar kept going, it would have probably been about the same size home ranges. And they were sisters. There was no doubt about it. They were the same size pig. They had the same colour markings, same weight, same everything. So they were two sisters from the same litter, and they just hung around together. Not far down the road, we caught a big boar that we called Boris, and you can see over that same period of time, his home range movements were much larger. And you can imagine that if he's got sows here, there was probably another couple of sows here, and probably another couple of sows here, and maybe some more sows up here. So his home range was significantly another order of magnitude greater than what Daisy and Molly's were. So trying to track him down would be a lot harder. But finding Daisy and Molly was not hard at all. Basically, we trapped them about here in a trap, and 5 months later, they really hadn't gone much further away than a kilometre. If we look at still my star performer, old Iron Mike, who we collared down in that neck of the woods as well. Basically the same size pig as Boris, but Boris was a bit of a fat pig. Iron Mike was superly a super heavyweight fighter. He had a lot of muscle on him, and he just moved. He was in prime condition, looking for mating opportunities, and he covered a lot of ground. He did 300 linear kilometres in 10 days. So trying to track him down is hard, very hard. And when you look at his home range over that same period of time, you're talking another order of magnitude again, 24,000, 25,000 hectares. So huge area that he covered. That's not always the case though, because this is another example I like to give. This is Arnie, who again was another good sized boar. We collared him in the Chittering Valley, and this is 5 months worth of data, and his home range is 36 hectares. He hardly went anywhere. And there's no reason, or there's no real surprise as to why he would have gone anywhere else. Because when we zoom in and have a look, you can see this is the Darling Scarp, so it's very steep. This is a lot of just natural bush. Not many people go up there. This is where he ate. This is where he drank, because he had some nice fresh water coming, a nice spring that came out of the scarp. And this is where he slept, up in the bush where no one disturbed him. So he didn't have to go a long distance, so he didn't. He didn't get disturbed. He could slip down into the paddocks under cover of darkness in the middle of the night, eat his fill, get a drink of water on the way home, and have a sleep on top of the hill. So whilst you get those animals that do move big distances, you don't necessarily always have to chase them. They're going to lead you a merry chase. Go for the ones that are easier to get bigger bang for your buck. And those are the sows. And the way to get those is, when it comes to pigs, is free feeding. That is the key to baiting or trapping pigs, or just concentrating pigs, is to pre-feed them, because they like an easy feed. Just like me, I'll eat takeout rather than cook myself a dinner because I'm lazy. I just love that easy feed. Now, you need to ensure that you're providing them with a good meal and not just giving them a taste. And that builds up that pattern of behaviour. And a good example of that pattern of behaviour, and again, this is not necessarily based around pre-feeding. This is some collared sows currently up in the northern ag region. We actually caught them in a trap here. We fed them into a trap here. But this paddock, this is an oat paddock or oat stubble that they're feeding in, and this is the patch of bush where they're sleeping. So this is their home range. This is their movements, their collared movements for the last week. And I just downloaded this morning, so this is hot off the press. So this is where the animals have gone for the last week. So they've basically been sleeping here. They traverse across the paddocks into the oat paddock and have a feed. Incredibly reliable with their movement there. But if we look at their home range, and look at that exactly again for the last 30 days, it's no different. They are like clockwork. And then if we go even further and say, well, what have they done over the last 90 days, the last 3 months? Basically nothing, apart from a quick sojourn down to the south here. They might have gone to someone's party or something. I don't know what happened there. They've basically been sleep in the bush, feed in the oat paddock, and move between the two, almost like clockwork. And that behaviour, that is what pigs do when they're not disturbed. And that is your best advantage. If you see them in the paddock and you start blasting at them with your rifle, that's going to disturb them. It's going to stop them from doing this. But if they've got a pattern and you can convince them, or you can encourage them or entice them into a trap or bait station by feeding them, that's when you're going to get them eating out of the palm of your hands, and that's when they become a lot easier to manage. So you need to think about how you're going to approach your pest control. With pigs, when we talk about baiting, there are two products. This is one example of us bucking the trend of losing our tools. we've actually just had a new toxin come onto the market. The first time a new vertebrate pesticide has been introduced since before the 70s, so the last 50 years, and it's sodium nitrite. So you have an option between using 1080 or using sodium nitrite. The main differences between the two are 1080 or sodium fluoroacetate requires a restricted chemical permit, so you need to be trained to use it. You need to have a permit to use it and a risk assessment on your property, whereas sodium nitrite, the hog-on bait, is a S6, so it's not a restricted chemical, so you don't need to have that permit, but you must follow the label instructions, and part of that is that must be fed to the pigs out of a hog hopper like this, so that only pigs can eat it. Because whilst our native fauna have an innate tolerance towards 1080 because they've evolved in a landscape with plants that produce it to protect themselves from herbivores, our native fauna do not have the same innate tolerance to sodium nitrite. And because we're using a high concentration, because pigs are a large animal, we need to make sure that our native fauna don't get into that bait box and eat that poison bait. Otherwise, it could have negative effects on them. This is an example of a picture perfect baiting program, really, where we had, again, this is from the Northern Ag region. We've got a lupin stubble or a lupin paddock where they were just starting to come up out of the ground. We've got a gully up this way with vegetation on it. Up the other end of the gully was another paddock that had a water trough in it, so the pigs were getting a drink there. They would shelter here in the gully, and they'd feed out here into the lupin paddock. So we're talking about an area that would be smaller smaller than the home range of what Arnie was. So these pigs were not going very far. But the farmer could see that they were moving out of the bush into his paddock through his fence. So this is where he established a bait station and started to pre-feed the pigs just here. And then this is an absolute clockwork. I'd almost say it will never happen like this again. It just works so perfectly. What he found was he had the pigs the next morning in the paddock adjacent to his bait station, and I think at the end of the day there was 17 or 18 all up, so there was a few more up the gully that had made it back to their bed. But basically what happened here was he'd been feeding them on this bait station so well that they were getting a feed, they were having a nibble of green pick, but they kept coming back to this bait station. So 1080 takes time to take effect, but basically they would have been hanging around this base station just about all night, and in the morning basically keeled over. So again, that effective use of the pig's behaviour, and this is what it looks like from ground level. It's like literally you're talking 10, 15 metres, the majority of the pigs were found within the vicinity of that bait station. I took photos of it because it might never, probably something as good as that might never happen again, but you never know. Similar sort of process or similar principles around baiting apply to trapping as well. It's getting the pigs accustomed to the trap, getting them accustomed to the feed, and making them reliant on that feed. And they will become habitual, because if you give them a good feed and you give them enough of a good feed, they'll stay there. A lot of people do ask, what's the best pig bait? The best pig bait that you can use, whether it's for anything, is whatever they're going to eat, whatever you have ready access to large volumes of, and is cheap. Generally, in the Northern Ag region, it's grain, because that's what they're eating out of the paddocks. Down south in the more forested areas, apples or fruit are a very commonly used bait, and the pigs really, really enjoy them. Generally, they're sweet, they've got moisture in them, they're a treat that can really get them encouraged. But again, it comes down to what you can get them to feed on. But you need to also keep in the back of your mind that there is legislation around swill feeding. So pigs are not to be fed meat or carcasses or any food scraps from supermarkets or from the kitchen. So it needs to be It needs to be fruits, vegetables, or grain that comes straight out of the paddock. But again, free feeding is important. As I always say, is that the trick to controlling pigs is pre-feed, 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 and patience. You need to get those pigs into a rhythm. If they're into a rhythm, it makes it easier for you to apply the control. Fencing. So we did talk about fencing before. Again, it can be used very well. This is a good example of an old sort of sheep fence that's busted up. The pigs, where there was pigs and kangaroos galore going through that fence. It was really not stopping anything except the most well-trained sheep or cow. You've got to have a dedicated fence, and it's got to be well maintained. And this is a good example of exclusion fence around Redius species in peat swamp that DBCA have established in the Walpole Wilderness area to protect the Redius species from pigs, and again, it works incredibly well. But if there's a food resource on the other side of that fence, at some point in time, pigs will push or they will pressure that fence. So that's why maintenance is important. And there is a variety of different fencing designs available. Pretty much all of them are expensive, one way or another. The idea is working out what's most likely to work best for you. But again, it's not just thinking about the pigs. If you're building a fence to exclude pigs, yet kangaroos are punching holes in that fence, they're just going to let the pigs come straight through as well. I've left shooting till last for pigs because it has its place, but it's not generally the first port of call. It is in real life. A lot of people jump on the shooting bandwagon, and I get it 100%. Driving around your farm, you see pigs digging up your paddock or your crop. What are you going to do? You're going to reach for the gun straight away. But what that does is you might get a couple of pigs, but it certainly alerts them to the sound of your car and the sound of the rifle. And they know next time they hear that car, time to keep away. Keep low, get out of here. The best sort of mantra that I can say, which is, and again, take it or leave it. It's easy to say, hard to do, is reach for a bucket of grain. Don't reach for the rifle, reach for a bucket of grain. Make them your friends. Make them think that you're the good person. If you're showing up at your bait station and putting feed out there, they'll hear that sound, they'll associate with you with the food, and it won't take long before 30 minutes after you've left, you've got pigs in your trap feeding, or you've got pigs on your bait station. They learn. They're smart. They're not dumb animals. Ground-based is really best applied once you've done trapping and baiting, or baiting and trapping. So cost effectiveness, baiting is your cheapest option in terms of control, followed by trapping. And ground shooting really designed, or really best applied to pick up those recalcitrant individuals that you haven't got through a baiting program or a trapping program. Aerial shooting captures the mind and imagination. It's great, it's exciting, but it's also expensive. That the Northern Ag sort of work that's been going on there, budget is very easily $10,000 a day per day of shooting. So it's not a cheap undertaking. You want to ensure that you're getting value for that money as well. So I'm going to wrap up there and stop berating you over the airwaves, but I'll just summarize what we've covered. Is the best approach to pest management is a strategic approach, a community approach, an approach with others, not by yourself, basically, and an approach that considers the pest or pests that you're going to target. And you need to know what you're targeting, how you're going to target them, what control tools are available. And I use plural tools because, remember, you can't use the one. If you use one tool to its pure exclusion, you are ultimately going to create a rod for your own back, because the animals will get wise to it and you will struggle to have an impact. And you need to be conscious of the landscape you're operating in and basically applying those 7 principles of pest management, and use these resources that are available on the Pest Smart website. Certainly, the DPIRD, the departmental website, is also a good resource for information. But certainly, the Pest Smart website, the resources available on there are really geared towards easily digestible, effectively packaged material that you can use and run with. But also, speak to your community groups, speak to your land care groups, and they can provide you with additional information or put you in contact with other people that can provide you with better information or more information at a local level or in a more general sense as well. So I'd like to thank you all very much for patiently listening to me talk about vertebrate pest management. And if anybody's got additional questions or want to ask me something, fire away.
Oh, thanks so much, Peter. That was so interesting. And from my perspective, knowing nothing about pest management, it's very fascinating. And particularly interesting about the pigs and their habit forming. I don't suppose rabbits or foxes are as clever as pigs, so you couldn't use any similar strategies with them, could you, in terms of bait stations and things like that?
Traditionally we well, for foxes traditionally we don't use bait stations, but certainly if people humour me, and if I just scroll back up and pick on my, if I can find the right slide, here we go. If we look here, this is a device called a canid pest ejector for foxes, and what it basically is a tethered, almost a tethered bait. But instead of having the toxin inside the meat like these baits do, what it does is it's got the poison or the toxin inside a little plastic capsule that fits down inside the middle. And there's a spring actuated plunger that when an animal, like a fox, comes along and tries to pick the bait up with its mouth, it releases that plunger, which then ejects the contents of that capsule, which is liquid, into the animal's mouth. And it's very sweet. And they'll typically just lick their lips and swallow it down, and they've ingested a lethal dose. So the idea behind those is it's tethered. The other benefit is that does kind of act like a bait station, because if the fox comes along and eats that bait but doesn't trigger the mechanism, it's no harm, no foul. It knows that there's food there. Rebait it, set it again, and that animal will come back. Whereas things like meat baits, like a toxic bait, if the fox caches those and picks them up and hides them and comes back to them later, there is a chance that the 1080 can leach out of that bait, and the bait becomes sublethal. And that's a really bad thing. That's something you want to avoid, because what happens then is the animal will eat that bait. It'll get sick because it's ingested 1080, but it won't die because it's sublethal. But it will then remember, oh, I got sick because I ate that bait. I'm not going to touch one of those again. It's like going to a restaurant and get food poisoning. You'll be a pretty brave person to go back to that restaurant again to have another meal. It's the same sort of principle here. With rabbits, we certainly do pre-feed. Typically, when we would lay bait in the old bait layers, traditionally they would either put out non-toxic bait and let the rabbits feed for a few nights, and then they'd come back and put toxic bait out. But certainly what we do use as well is rabbit bait that's got toxic grain, about one toxic oat mixed in with 100 non-toxic oats. And what happens is we lay that line of grain out for the rabbits to feed, and it might take a couple of nights for the rabbits to actually consume a toxic bait, because what we did find was when it was totally toxic, the more the braver rabbits would quickly come onto that bait station and start to eat, and then they'd drop dead. And their more wary friends would go, I don't think I want to eat that because Fred dropped dead when he ate it. This way, it's a lot longer. It's more hit and miss until they get a toxic oat, and then you get the other animals will be enticed to come on and feed, and you get a much better knockdown of the population. So we do use free feeding for other species as well, but pigs is one that we really concentrate and focus on, that to gain their trust and get that behaviour to work to our advantage.
I know that you haven't covered feral cats on in this, and it wasn't the intention.
Yeah.
But someone has actually asked a question. We're almost out of time, but maybe um, do you have any tips? Are you for feral cats? If you can speak about them at all?
Yeah, they're a bit tricky. There's no registered control technique or prescribed control technique for feral cats other than cage traps, which truly feral cats, they will go into them, but it's a bit tricky. I mean, you'll catch a cat in a cage trap easier than you'll catch a fox, or the Eradicat bait. But the Eradicat bait is not commercially available. You need to get a permit and approval through the Department of Biodiversity, Conservation and Attraction, so Parks and Wildlife. So, and it's it's not something that you can get off the shelf. So you need to liaise with your local DBCA to talk about what options are available if they're available to use that product. So we're limited in the control techniques available for cats, and sorry, shooting as well. But certainly the department did declare feral cats as a pest. Last year, or the year before. My memory, 2020 really took a chunk out of my timeline. But certainly, as a declared pest, that does provide protection under the Animal Welfare Act for people that are controlling cats. It is a defence against the Welfare Act that you're controlling a declared pest. So we are limited on approved or prescribed techniques for controlling feral cats.
Hmm. Well, maybe that's something we can explore a bit later in the year. But what can I say? Thank you so much for a really fascinating and interesting presentation and insight on how to manage pests. And I guess the moral of the story is that we really need to be working together in order to get on
Absolutely,
top of it. Mm.
I certainly banged on about that to an exorbitant amount. Absolutely, there's always. It's not to say that you can't make a local difference on your property by yourself, but you will see much better achievements and much better results by working in concert with your neighbours, for sure.
Yeah. All right. Well, I think we'll close up now because we're